There are places in the world that people call paradise. Crystal clear water, perfect weather year-round, remote anchorages where you can drop your hook and live the cruising dream. These are the destinations every sailor fantasizes about, the places in the magazines, the spots that fill Instagram feeds with turquoise water and boats at anchor against picture-perfect sunsets. But if you visit these paradise anchorages right now, you're going to see something that doesn't make it into those glossy photos, something that the tourism boards don't talk about and the cruising community whispers about, but won't discuss openly. Boats are accumulating in these anchorages, not healthy, well-maintained cruising boats preparing for the next passage, degraded vessels, abandoned boats, literal floating graveyards of dreams that died where paradise was supposed to begin. And the reason this is happening, the reason boats and their crews are ending up stranded in the very places they sailed halfway around the world to reach, it's not what you think. It's not weather, it's not pirates, it's not mechanical failure. It's something far more insidious, something that says more about what's broken in the world of cruising than anything else possibly could. I'm going to show you what's really happening in these paradise anchorages. Why boats are accumulating and rotting in places that were supposed to be the reward for years of planning and sacrifice, and what it reveals about the dark side of the cruising dream that nobody wants to acknowledge. What you're about to learn is going to change how you see cruising. It's going to shatter some illusions that the cruising industry has carefully maintained for decades. It's going to expose vulnerabilities and risks that cruisers face, but rarely discuss, because admitting them means admitting that the dream might be more fragile than anyone wants to believe. And it's going to show you that the paradise anchorages, the destinations that represent the ultimate achievement for cruisers, they're becoming traps. Beautiful, terrible traps where dreams go to die and boats become permanent residents, not by choice, but by circumstance. This is the story nobody's telling. The hidden crisis in paradise, the boats that arrived but can never leave, and the heartbreaking human stories behind every abandoned vessel rotting in turquoise water. Stay with me, because this is important, not just for cruisers, but for anyone who's ever dreamed about sailing away from it all, about finding freedom on the ocean, about reaching those perfect anchorages and living the life. Because that dream, as beautiful as it is, has a dark side. And in paradise, that dark side is becoming impossible to ignore. Let me paint you a picture of what I'm talking about, because until you see it, until you understand what's actually happening in these anchorages, the scale and the tragedy of it won't fully register. Imagine you're sailing into a remote anchorage in the Caribbean, or the South Pacific, or Southeast Asia. One of those places that looks exactly like the screensaver on your computer, the kind of beauty that doesn't seem real. You drop your anchor, you look around, and you start noticing things. That boat 50 yards away, it's listing slightly, and the canvas is torn and hanging. That boat over there, it's sitting low in the water like it's taking on water slowly. That one has growth on the waterline that suggests it hasn't moved in months, maybe years. You see boats with broken masts, boats with dinghies that are deflated and rotting on deck, boats that clearly nobody's living on, but nobody's removed either. And if you talk to the locals, if you ask the other cruisers, you learn that these are the ghosts, the boats that came but never left, the vessels whose owners ran out of money or got sick or had emergencies and had to fly home, leaving the boat behind because they couldn't afford to ship it back or sell it or even properly abandon it. These boats are just sitting there, slowly deteriorating, becoming environmental hazards, creating eyesores in paradise. And it's not just a few boats. In some anchorages, there are dozens of these derelict vessels. The authorities don't have resources to remove them. The owners are long gone, often unreachable. The boats just sit and rot, and more keep arriving. Because here's what's happening, and this is the part that's truly heartbreaking. Cruisers are reaching these paradise destinations and discovering that they're trapped. Not physically trapped, they could theoretically sail away if they wanted to. But practically, financially, psychologically trapped. They've spent everything to get here. They've sailed thousands of miles. They've lived their dream. They've reached paradise. And now they can't afford to leave. They can't afford to keep going. They can't afford to sail home. And they can't afford to stay either. So they're stuck in this limbo, watching their savings drain away, watching their boats deteriorate from lack of proper maintenance, making increasingly desperate choices that lead inexorably toward abandonment. This is what the boat graveyards represent. Not failed adventures, but successful adventures that reached their destination and discovered the destination was a dead end. Now, before I go further, let me explain why this is happening now, why we're seeing this phenomenon accelerate to crisis levels. Because paradise anchorages have always had some derelict boats. That's not new. What's new is the scale, the rate at which it's happening, and the demographics of who's affected. This isn't just about unprepared cruisers who got in over their heads. This is affecting experienced sailors, people who did everything right, who planned carefully, who had adequate resources when they started. So what changed? What's turning paradise into a trap for so many cruisers? The answer is complex, multifaceted, and it involves forces that individual cruisers have no control over. But understanding these forces is crucial to understanding the tragedy playing out in these anchorages. The first force is economic. The cost of cruising has exploded over the past 5 years. Marina fees, when you need them, have doubled or tripled. Haul-outs and bottom paint, necessary maintenance in tropical waters, have become shockingly expensive. Parts and repairs, which you inevitably need when cruising, cost far more than they did even a few years ago, especially in remote locations where everything has to be shipped in. Provisions are more expensive. Diesel is more expensive. Every aspect of cruising costs more. Cruisers who left with budgets they thought were adequate, budgets based on research and advice from people who cruised 5 years ago, those budgets are insufficient now. They're burning through money faster than anticipated. And when you're in a remote anchorage, when you're thousands of miles from home, when that money runs low, your options narrow dramatically. You can't just sail back quickly. Passages take time. They require provisions and fuel. They have their own costs. Some cruisers reach a point where they literally can't afford to leave. They don't have enough money to provision for the passage home. They're stuck. The second force is mechanical. Boats break. That's not new. But the difficulty and expense of fixing boats in remote locations has increased enormously. Parts that used to be available through local marine suppliers now have to be ordered internationally and shipped, which takes weeks or months and costs a fortune. Local mechanics, where they exist, charge premium rates for working on foreign boats, and many repairs simply can't be done locally. You need specialized equipment or expertise that doesn't exist. So cruisers face repairs that would cost $5,000 at home, costing $20,000 in a remote location, if they can be done at all. And if you can't make the repairs, you can't safely sail on. You're stuck with a boat that needs work you can't afford in a location where you're spending money just to exist. Every day you stay, the financial situation gets worse. Every day you delay the repair, the boat deteriorates further and the problem compounds. It's a trap with no good exits. The third force is medical. Cruisers get sick, they get injured, they age. This is reality, but it's a reality that the cruising dream doesn't really account for. When you're cruising in remote areas, medical care is limited or non-existent. If something serious happens, you need to be evacuated to a place with proper facilities. That means leaving the boat. If it's serious enough, it means flying home. And suddenly, you have a boat in a remote anchorage, and you're on another continent recovering from surgery or dealing with a health crisis. The boat is now a problem to be dealt with later, except later often never comes. The medical issue takes longer to resolve than expected. The costs of treatment drain the resources that would have been used to retrieve the boat, and the boat sits. Maybe the owner intends to come back, maybe they even try. But the longer the boat sits unattended in a tropical anchorage, the more problems develop. Systems fail, locals sometimes strip valuable items, the boat takes on water or drags anchor. By the time the owner could come back, the boat is no longer worth saving. Paradise became a graveyard. The fourth force, and this might be the most heartbreaking, is psychological. Cruising is hard, really hard. The magazines show the beautiful anchorages and the sunset cocktails. They don't show the mechanical breakdowns, the scary weather, the exhaustion, the relationship stress, the isolation, the constant vigilance, the physical toll. A lot of cruisers reach these paradise destinations completely burned out. They sailed thousands of miles, they earned this paradise, but they're exhausted and traumatized by the journey, and instead of feeling the triumph and joy they expected, they feel depleted. They've lost their motivation to continue. They need a break. But breaks are expensive. The boat still needs maintenance, still needs attention, still costs money. The cruiser needs recovery time, but there's no economic pause button. And in that vulnerable state, small setbacks become insurmountable. Equipment failure that should be manageable feels impossible. A financial squeeze that could be solved with careful planning feels catastrophic. The psychological depletion means cruisers can't respond effectively to challenges that they would have handled competently under normal circumstances. They freeze, they avoid, they hope things will somehow get better. And while they're frozen in this psychological trap, the boat deteriorates and the situation gets progressively worse until abandonment starts looking like the only way out. Now let me tell you some specific stories because the statistics and forces are abstract until you see how they play out in individual human lives. I'm going to tell you about 3 boats I encountered in a Caribbean anchorage last year. I'm not going to use real names because these are real people dealing with real tragedy and they deserve privacy. But these stories are representative of what's happening throughout paradise anchorages worldwide. The first boat belonged to a couple in their 60s. They'd retired, sold their house, bought a boat, and set off to live the cruising dream. They were experienced sailors. They'd done coastal cruising for years. They thought they were prepared. They sailed from Florida to the Caribbean, island hopping, and it was everything they hoped for, until the husband had a stroke. Not a massive one, but serious enough that he needed medical care beyond what was available locally. They flew back to the States for treatment. The boat was left in the anchorage with a plan to come back once he recovered. But recovery was slower than expected. Medicare wouldn't cover a return to retrieve the boat. Their savings, already depleted by cruising expenses, were getting consumed by medical costs. Months passed. The boat sat. Locals reported that it was dragging anchor and had damaged another boat. The authorities were threatening action. The couple couldn't afford to fly back and deal with it. They couldn't afford to hire someone to sail it back. They couldn't sell it remotely for anything close to what it was worth. So it sits, still sits, rotting in paradise. Their retirement dream turned into an abandoned boat they're still technically responsible for, but can't do anything about. That's a graveyard boat. That's the heartbreaking reality. The second boat belonged to a solo sailor in his 50s. He'd saved for 20 years to go cruising. He'd read all the books, joined the cruising forums, done everything by the book. He quit his job, bought a solid boat, and headed south. He made it to the Caribbean successfully and was planning to continue to the South Pacific. But in the Caribbean, his boat suffered damage in a storm. Not catastrophic damage, but the mast had stress fractures and needed replacing. The quote for a new mast, shipped to his location and installed, was $60,000. His entire remaining cruising budget was $40,000. He couldn't afford the repair. He couldn't safely sail without it. He started looking for alternatives. Could he jury rig something? Could he motor back to the States? Could he sell the boat as is? None of these options worked. The jury rig wasn't safe for ocean passages. Motoring that far would require more fuel than he could carry and cost more than he had. And nobody wanted to buy a boat with a damaged mast in a remote location. He was trapped. He lived on the boat for 8 more months, spending his remaining money, getting increasingly desperate. Eventually he couldn't afford food and marina fees anymore. He abandoned the boat and flew home using his last credit card reserves. The boat is still there, mast still damaged, no owner. It's become someone else's problem, except nobody else wants it either. So it sits, Another boat in the graveyard. The third boat was owned by a younger couple with two small children. They'd been cruising for 3 years, documenting their journey on social media, living the dream. They made money through online work and sponsorships from cruising-related companies. They reached a beautiful anchorage in the Eastern Caribbean and were posting enthusiastic updates about how this was what they'd worked so hard to achieve. Then the online income dried up. One of their sponsors went out of business. Their freelance clients reduced hours due to economic conditions. Their income dropped by 70% basically overnight. They tried to adjust, tried to find new income sources, but they were in a remote location with poor internet. They couldn't do the kind of work they needed to do. They burned through their savings in 2 months. They couldn't afford to keep cruising. They couldn't afford provisions for the passage back. They couldn't afford marina fees or hauling the boat. They were stuck with 2 young children in an increasingly desperate situation. They ended up contacting family for money to fly home. The boat was left behind with vague promises. They'd figure something out later. That was a year ago. The boat is still there. The couple is back in the States trying to rebuild their lives. They posted once about having to make an impossible choice. Then they stopped posting about it. The boat, their home for 3 years. Their dream made real. It's just another abandoned vessel in paradise. Nobody wants to hear that story. It doesn't fit the narrative, but it's real. These aren't isolated incidents. This is a pattern. And the pattern is accelerating. More cruisers are reaching paradise and getting trapped. More boats are being abandoned. More dreams are ending in heartbreak. And the cruising industry, the boat manufacturers, the marine industry, the media that promotes the lifestyle, they're not talking about this. They're still selling the dream. They're still showing the beautiful photos. They're still encouraging people to go cruising without adequately preparing them for these risks. Because acknowledging these risks, talking openly about how paradise can become a trap, it would hurt the industry. It would discourage potential cruisers. It would raise uncomfortable questions about whether the cruising lifestyle as marketed is actually sustainable for most people. So the industry stays silent, and more boats accumulate in the graveyards. Let me be clear about something, because I don't want to be misunderstood. Cruising can be wonderful. There are people who cruise successfully for years, who manage the risks, who have great experiences and return safely. This isn't about saying cruising is impossible or that nobody should do it. This is about saying that cruising as currently marketed and understood is fundamentally dishonest. The risks are understated. The costs are underestimated. The difficulties are minimized. The escape routes are assumed to exist when they often don't, and people are making life-altering decisions to go cruising based on incomplete and sometimes actively misleading information. They're selling everything. They're leaving jobs and communities. They're taking enormous financial and personal risks, and they're not fully informed about what could go wrong. That's not fair. That's not ethical. And the result is boats rotting in paradise and people's lives derailed in devastating ways. So what needs to change? First, the cruising industry needs to be honest about costs. The budgets that cruising guides suggest are wildly inadequate for current conditions. People need to know that cruising now costs roughly double what it cost 5 years ago in most locations. They need realistic numbers, not aspirational minimums. Second, cruisers need better information about what to do when things go wrong. Right now, the assumption is that you can always sail home or sell the boat or find a way out. But those assumptions aren't always true. There needs to be honest discussion about what happens when you're trapped, what resources exist, what options are actually available versus what options people assume exist. Third, there needs to be better infrastructure for dealing with cruising emergencies. Right now, if you get stuck in a remote location, you're basically on your own. There are some cruising organizations that try to help, but they're underfunded and overwhelmed. There need to be better support systems, better emergency funds, better processes for safely extracting cruisers from situations that have become untenable. And fourth, there needs to be honest acknowledgement that not everyone who starts cruising will finish successfully. that some percentage of cruisers will have things go wrong in ways they can't control. And that's okay. That shouldn't be shameful, but it needs to be planned for and prepared for, rather than treated as a personal failure that we don't discuss. The boat graveyards in paradise, they're a symptom of a system that's broken, a cruising culture and industry that prioritizes selling the dream over preparing people for reality. And until that changes, more boats will accumulate in those beautiful anchorages. More dreams will end in heartbreak and abandonment. More cruisers will find that paradise became a trap they couldn't escape. I've shown you what's happening. I've told you the stories. I've explained the forces that create these situations. Now you know what those glossy cruising magazines aren't showing you. You know what happens to some of the boats that reach paradise. You know that the dream, as beautiful as it is, has a dark side that can swallow people whole. If you're thinking about cruising, please take this seriously. Plan for twice the costs you think you'll need. Plan for things going wrong. Plan for needing to exit quickly. Don't burn all your bridges. Don't spend all your money getting there. Don't assume you can always find a way out, because paradise can become a prison, and your boat can become another grave in a beautiful place that was supposed to be the reward for years of sacrifice and dreaming. The reason is heartbreaking, but it's real, and it's happening right now in paradise anchorages around the world.